I'll just give you $20, honey. Your mom and dad are just visiting, not coming for a banquet. The sentence was spoken lightly, but it landed in the middle of our kitchen like a small stone dropped into calm water. The ripple wasn't large, but it spread in silent, piercing circles. That morning, Sarah was finishing washing a bunch of spinach when she heard her husband's voice from the living room. Her husband's name was Mike, the man she had chosen 4 years ago. After a wedding that wasn't lavish but was warm enough to make her believe she had found her anchor, Sarah didn't turn around immediately. Her hands were still methodically trimming the spinach, discarding any wilted leaves, but her ears didn't miss a single word. "Did you hear me, sweetie? $20. Don't buy anything fancy. Your parents are used to simple food." Mike's voice was flat, not yelling, not raised. But it was that very calmness that made it more painful than anger. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out of the kitchen. She looked at Mike. Her gaze held no hatred, only a flicker of doubt. "Are you serious, Mike?" Mike, who was scrolling on his phone, looked up and frowned. "Do you think I'm joking? The electric and water bills went up this month, and I had to send extra money to my mom. We need to be frugal." Sarah nodded slowly. She didn't argue right away. Since getting married, she had learned one thing: sometimes, talking more changes nothing, and only makes the atmosphere more tense. But inside her, something felt like it was hardening. Mike sighed and put his phone down. "Sarah, you have to be realistic. We're not a wealthy family. Besides, your parents are from a small town, they're used to simple meals. Why do you have to make such a big deal out of it?" The phrase, "big deal," made Sarah pause. It wasn't because she wanted to serve a luxurious feast, but because she wanted her parents to feel valued. She didn't say that, though. She only asked quietly. "So with $20, what do you think I should buy?" Mike shrugged. "You can figure it out. Some vegetables, potatoes, maybe some ground beef, a few eggs. That should be enough. What we eat every day is what we'll serve them." "What's the difference?" Sarah was silent for a few seconds, then held out her hand to take the single bill Mike had placed on the coffee table. The green paper felt light, yet so heavy in her hand. "All right, I understand," she said, then turned back to the kitchen without another word, without a sigh, without showing any disappointment. Only her footsteps felt a little slower. Outside, Mike picked up his phone again, as if the conversation had meant nothing at all. Sarah grew up in a small farming town on the bend of a river, where daily meals were sometimes just a clear soup and cornbread, but were always accompanied by laughter. Her father, John, was a quiet man who had been a farmer his whole life. Her mother, Martha, was a hard-working woman who, besides working the fields, also raised a few chickens to supplement their income. Their family wasn't rich, but they were never short on love. When Sarah got married, her parents had only one piece of advice: in your husband's home, live well. Don't compare what you have to others. But don't ever let anyone look down on you. Sarah always remembered that advice, but she often wondered if what she was practicing was patience, or if she was letting things go too far. Like this morning, carrying her shopping tote to the local grocery store. The walk wasn't long, but today she walked more slowly than usual, perhaps because she was mentally calculating every cent of that $20. She stood in the produce aisle, checking the price of everything. Spinach, potatoes, carrots, all could be turned into a delicious meal. But how could she make it enough for 4 people without it looking too meager? The produce manager, a man who knew her by name, smiled. "Cooking for company, Sarah? Keeping it simple today?" Sarah returned the smile. "Yes, sir, just a simple meal for my parents." The man glanced at her nearly empty tote, then leaned in. "Simple is fine, honey, but it should still be nice. These chicken thighs are on sale today. You could make a nice soup." Sarah thanked him and picked out a few tomatoes. She continued to the dairy aisle and bought half a dozen eggs. With the remaining money, she stopped at the deli counter and looked at the smoked sausages. The distinct aroma reminded her of home, where her mother would often slice and fry them to eat with mashed potatoes and green beans. She asked for the price. The number wasn't too high. Sarah thought for a moment, then bought a small link. Her total came to exactly $19.85. She bought nothing else. On the way home, Sarah didn't feel sad, as one might imagine. She just felt that everything had become clearer. Clearer about how Mike viewed their life, and clearer about how she needed to live hers from now on. Sarah's parents arrived just before noon. John wore an older but clean-collared shirt. He carried a small duffel bag. Martha brought a tin of homemade oatmeal cookies. As soon as she stepped inside, she smiled. "Oh, your home is so tidy. It's wonderful you can keep it so clean in the city." Sarah rushed to greet them, her voice sounding brighter than it felt. Mom, Dad, was the drive tiring? Not at all. We're used to a few hours on the road. It's nothing. Mike came out of the bedroom, a polite but distant smile on his face. Oh, John, Martha, you're here. Come on in. Have a seat and rest. His words were courteous but lacked real enthusiasm. For him, the in-laws' visit wasn't a major event. John nodded, glancing around the small apartment before sitting down. It must be expensive to live here, son. Mike offered a thin smile. It is, John. You have to be smart with your money. That sentence, whether intentional or not, sent a small pang of pain through Sarah. She quickly changed the subject. Dad, Mom, you two rest. I'm going to finish up in the kitchen. Martha stood. Let me help. No, Mom, please. Just sit. I can handle it, Sarah said, turning back to the kitchen. The small kitchen was neat. She placed her shopping tote on the counter and took out its contents, one by one. Spinach, tomatoes, eggs, chicken thighs, smoked sausage. At a glance, it did look like a very simple meal, but to Sarah, that wasn't the point. She began to cook. She re-washed the spinach, sliced the tomatoes, and beat the eggs. She slowly pan-fried slices of the sausage, letting the savory aroma fill the air. The smell reminded her of evenings back home when the whole family would gather around the stove. She did everything slowly and deliberately, not to waste time, but because she was pouring something more than just ingredients into the meal. In the living room, Martha asked Mike. How's work going, son? The usual, Martha. Some months are good, some are slow. Well, that's business. You have to keep your spirits up. John was quieter. He just nodded occasionally, his gaze sometimes drifting toward the kitchen where his daughter was busy. After a moment, he asked, Is Sarah doing okay here? It's not too much for her? The simple question made Mike pause for a moment. He answered, It's the same for everyone, John. Life in the city means there's a lot to manage. John didn't ask any more questions. He looked down at his own hands and said softly, My daughter has been a hard worker since she was a little girl. But she's also very considerate of other people's feelings. Mike nodded without a word. The atmosphere grew a little quiet. In the kitchen, Sarah arranged the food on a serving tray. A plate of bright green sautéed spinach, a bowl of steaming chicken noodle soup, a plate of golden brown sausage slices, and in the very center of the tray, she placed something that, at first glance, would make anyone feel it was out of place. She looked at the spread for a moment, then took a slow breath. It was ready. She called out, Dad, Mom, Mike, lunch is ready. Her voice was as gentle as always. But no one knew that this lunch would be unlike any they had had before. Sarah carried the tray of food to the dining table. Her steps were slow but steady. She placed the tray in the middle, adjusted each bowl and plate, and then sat down. At a glance, the meal was as simple as Mike had suggested that morning. Sautéed greens, tomato soup, fried sausage. But in the center of the table was a small plate, and on it lay a pale yellow envelope, neatly folded. The envelope wasn't thick, but its position right in the middle of the table made it the center of attention. Mike, who had just sat down, saw it immediately and frowned. What is this? Sarah didn't answer right away. She served soup into her parents' bowls first, then said softly, Let's eat first, Mike. You'll find out. Sarah's indirect answer annoyed Mike. He didn't like conversations that beat around the bush. What are you up to now? I told you to cook something simple. What's with all this drama? Sarah still didn't look at him. She placed some spinach on her mother's plate. It is simple, Mike. Her voice was soft, not argumentative, but also not as submissive as it usually was. John sat there, looking from the food to the envelope. He didn't ask, just remained silent. Martha, however, looked a little hesitant. Sarah, what is this, honey? Sarah turned to her mother and gave a faint smile. I'll explain after we eat, Mom. The way she spoke made Martha stop asking. She picked up her fork, but her eyes kept darting to the envelope in the middle of the table. Mike couldn't restrain himself. He reached for the envelope, turning it over in his hands. Why would you put this on the dining table? Who eats while staring at an envelope? Sarah looked at him. This time, her gaze was direct. Just open it, Mike. Mike paused for a moment, then slowly tore open the edge of the envelope. Inside were just a few folded pieces of paper. He unfolded them. On the first sheet, in Sarah's neat, clear handwriting, it said, $20, grocery money for Mom and Dad's visit. Mike finished reading and his frown deepened. He turned to the next page. The second sheet was an itemized list of expenses. Chicken thighs, $6.50 tomatoes, $2.85 eggs, half dozen, $1.99 smoked sausage, $4.50 spinach, $2.35 potatoes, unpancisis. Total. $19.85. Every line was written meticulously, down to the last cent. Mike stared at it for a moment, then let out a small laugh. A laugh that didn't sound happy. What are you doing this for? I told you to just cook with the money I gave you. Sarah nodded. Yes, Mike. I did exactly what you said. She paused, then continued in the same calm voice. I just wanted you to see, clearly, what $20 can get. The atmosphere at the table grew tense. Martha looked from her daughter to her son-in-law, unsure of what to say. John was still silent, but the look in his eyes had changed, as if he were thinking much more deeply. Mike placed the paper on the table, his voice rising slightly. Okay, I've seen it. So what? Is there a problem? It was still enough for a meal, right? Sarah looked straight at him. Yes, Mike. It's enough to eat. But is it enough to make my parents feel welcome? The question, not asked loudly, was enough to silence Mike. He couldn't answer. Sarah didn't press him. She turned to her parents. Mom, Dad, please try some. I fried the sausage just like we do back home. Martha took a piece, chewed it slowly, and nodded. Yes, honey. It tastes just right. It's been a long time since I've had this. John also took some vegetables. After eating a bite, he said, greens sautéed like this are delicious. You don't need anything fancy. Hearing that, Mike seemed to get a second wind. He smiled faintly. See? Your dad and mom said so themselves. Simple is good enough. Sarah didn't argue. She just continued eating, but her gaze was no longer avoidant as it had been before. Lunch continued, but the atmosphere was no longer as comfortable as it had been at the start. After a while, John put down his fork and looked at Mike. Mike, son. Yes, John? What is it? You work hard. I know the cost of living in the city is high. I understand that. Mike nodded. That's right, John. Everything has to be calculated carefully. John nodded slowly, then continued. But there are times when being frugal isn't always a good thing. The statement made Mike stiffen slightly. John didn't say much more, just spoke softly. A little money or a lot of money isn't as important as how we treat each other. The entire table fell silent. Sarah sat there, listening to her father's every word, her heart feeling both warm and constricted. Mike didn't argue, but the expression on his face had changed. He wasn't used to being corrected so directly, especially by his father-in-law. He tried to keep his voice normal. Yes, John, I understand. But I think we have to be realistic. We shouldn't be wasteful just because of pride. Sarah smiled faintly. This time, it was a slightly bitter but still gentle smile. You think I wanted to show off, Mike? Mike looked at her. That's not what I meant. But you put this envelope on the table, writing down every cent. Weren't you trying to prove something? Sarah shook her head. No, Mike. I wasn't trying to prove anything. She paused, then continued in a softer voice. I just wanted you to understand how I feel. Mike fell silent. Sarah looked down at her plate of food, then said, My parents didn't come here for a fancy meal. They came to see that their daughter is living a good life and is respected. She lifted her face and looked straight at Mike. Not as someone who has to count every penny just to welcome her own parents. The sentence wasn't spoken loudly, but it seemed to freeze the air. Martha whispered softly, Sarah, that's enough, honey. But Sarah gently shook her head. It's okay, Mom. I just want Mike to understand. Mike could no longer maintain the calm composure he'd had that morning. He put down his fork and sighed. So what do you want? You want me to give you more money? You want me to give in to all your wishes? Sarah looked at him. Her gaze wasn't angry, just tired. I don't want you to give me more money. I just want you to stop treating me like I'm just living off you. The sentence landed lightly, but with absolute clarity. Mike was stunned. Sarah continued in the same flat tone. Ever since I quit my job to take care of our home, you've said things like that often. Maybe you didn't mean it seriously, but I've heard it enough times to know how you see me. Mike opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sarah didn't press him. She just went on, as if telling a story. Being at home doesn't mean I do nothing. I manage the meals, the cleaning, the budget. All of that may not earn a paycheck, but without it, this home wouldn't run either. She gave a faint smile. But maybe you think none of that has any value. Mike looked down, no longer meeting her eyes. The atmosphere at the dining table became utterly silent. A few moments later, John stood up. "Well, I'm full. I think I'll get some fresh air on the porch," he said, walking outside. Martha stood to follow him. Inside, only Sarah and Mike were left. They sat facing each other, but the distance between them felt vast. Mike spoke first, his voice no longer as rigid as before. "I didn't realize it would turn into this." Sarah looked at him gently. "Because you never tried to put yourself in my shoes." Mike was silent. Sarah stood and began to clear the plates. "Just think about it, Mike. I don't need an answer right now." She carried the stack of plates to the kitchen, leaving Mike alone at the dining table. Mike stared at the envelope still lying on the table, then at the leftover food. For the first time, he felt that the simple lunch was not simple at all. And the envelope wasn't the thing that made him most uncomfortable, it was everything that it forced him to think about. After the lunch that day, a strange silence settled over Sarah and Mike's small home. It wasn't a heavy, suffocating silence, but one that made you feel something was unresolved, something left unsaid. Sarah stood in the kitchen, washing dishes. Water flowed calmly from the faucet. Her hands moved as they always did, but her mind was no longer as light as it used to be. She wasn't angry, nor did she want to escalate the issue. But what she had just said felt like a door that had been opened. And once opened, she couldn't pretend it had never happened. On the porch, John sat in a plastic chair, holding a cup of tea Sarah had just made for him. He looked out at the narrow street in front of the house, where people passed by, each with their own story. Martha sat beside him and asked quietly, "You see something's not right with them, don't you?" John didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of his tea, then said softly, "Sarah has been holding that in for a long time." Martha sighed. "I felt that too. Ever since she moved here, every time we call, she says everything is fine. But from the sound of her voice, I knew she was hiding something." John nodded. "She's just like you were when you were young. You kept everything to yourself, afraid of making others uncomfortable." Martha smiled faintly, but her eyes held a trace of sadness. "But if you keep bottling it up, one day, it's bound to explode." The two of them sat there without speaking further. They didn't blame their son-in-law, but they also couldn't ignore what had just happened. Inside, Mike was still sitting at the dining table. Before him lay the envelope Sarah had left. He had read it several times, but he still felt unsettled. He was a practical person. Since childhood, he had been independent and always calculated things carefully. His father had passed away when he was young, and his mother had raised him and his sibling alone. Because of that, for him, money had always been something to be considered with great care. He didn't feel he was wrong for wanting to be frugal, but Sarah's words kept echoing in his mind. "I just want you to stop treating me like I'm just living off you." He sighed, picked up the envelope, and examined every stroke of his wife's handwriting. The handwriting he had seen when Sarah addressed their wedding invitations, when she made lists of things for their new home. He used to think her writing was beautiful, now it felt a little distant. He stood up and walked to the kitchen. Sarah was still washing dishes. Hearing his footsteps, she knew it was Mike, but didn't turn around. Mike stood behind her for a moment, then said, "Let me help." Sarah paused. He rarely ever said those words. She turned and shook her head. "It's okay, Mike. I'm almost done." Mike didn't move. He took a clean dish towel and stood beside her. "Then I'll dry the dishes." Sarah looked at him for a few seconds, then said nothing more. She continued washing, and Mike began to dry. The two of them stood side by side, so close, yet neither of them spoke. After a few moments, Mike said, "I didn't realize you felt that way." Sarah didn't stop her work. "I don't blame you for thinking I'm just living off you." Mike started to interrupt, but Sarah cut him off, her voice still calm. "You never said it directly, but the way you act made me feel that way." Mike fell silent. Sarah placed the last dish on the rack, then turned to face him. "Try to think about it. If you were in my position, would you feel comfortable?" Mike couldn't answer. Sarah didn't push him, just added, "Let's just move past it for now. Mom and Dad are still here. Let's not make the atmosphere unpleasant," she said, then walked out of the kitchen. Mike was left alone, still holding the dish towel. For the first time, he felt he didn't know what to say next. That afternoon, Sarah brewed tea and served the homemade cookies her mother had brought. The whole family sat in the living room. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had at noon. Martha took a cookie and smiled. "I baked these this morning. It's getting harder to find cookies like this back home." Sarah looked happy. "I've missed these so much, Mom. You used to make them for me all the time when I was little." Mike also took one, tasted it, and nodded. They're delicious, Martha. That simple compliment made Martha's smile widen. If you like them, have some more, son. John looked at his son-in-law and asked, what are your work hours like, Mike? I have an office job, John, but I often work overtime. Sometimes I don't get home until late. Well, whatever the job, you have to take care of your health. The conversation shifted to ordinary things. No one mentioned the lunch incident again, but its remnants still lingered. After a while, Martha stood up. Sarah, I'd like to see the farmer's market near here. I heard the markets in the city are very different from the ones in our town. Sarah nodded. Okay, Mom. I'll take you. Mike spoke up. I'll drive you and Mom. Sarah looked at him, a little surprised. He rarely took the initiative like this. You don't have to, Mike. It's close enough to walk. But Mike shook his head. It's fine. I don't have anything else to do. So the three of them went to the market. John chose to stay home and rest. The afternoon market wasn't too crowded but was lively with sellers and buyers. Laughter and conversation filled the air. Martha looked around, her eyes sparkling. Wow, there are so many different things at the market here. Sarah smiled. Yes, Mom. You can find anything, but the prices are higher. Mike walked beside them, not saying much, only answering when his mother-in-law asked a question. After a while, Martha stopped at a butcher's stall. The meat looks so fresh. It's rare to get cuts like this back home now. Sarah looked at the prices and seemed a little hesitant. Mike noticed and immediately asked the butcher, how much for a pound of the stew beef? The butcher told him the price. Mike didn't hesitate. I'll take 2 pounds, please. Sarah turned to look at him. What are you buying that for, Mike? For dinner tonight. Sarah whispered. But we still have leftovers. Mike looked at her and said softly, it's okay. This will be nicer. That simple sentence surprised Sarah a little. That morning, he was counting every penny, but now, he said nothing more. After they finished shopping, the three of them continued their walk. The atmosphere was more relaxed, even filled with laughter. That evening, Sarah returned to the kitchen. But this time, the ingredients she was cooking with were no longer bound by a $20 budget. She was making a beef stew. Its rich aroma filled the entire house. Mike stood in the kitchen doorway, looking in. Can I help with anything? Sarah turned and smiled faintly. As long as you don't get in my way, that's help enough. Mike smiled back. The atmosphere between them, though not fully back to normal, was no longer as tense as before. Dinner that night felt warmer. Not because there was more food, but because the atmosphere was different. There was no envelope on the table. But what caught Mike's attention was how Sarah remained so diligent. Even after saying things that weren't easy that morning, she still took care of everything perfectly. He looked at his wife and suddenly realized that perhaps he had grown too accustomed to all the perfection Sarah provided, to the point that he had forgotten its value. Dinner proceeded comfortably, filled with laughter and stories. But when everyone had gone to bed, Mike was still awake. He remembered every word Sarah had spoken, every look from his in-laws. And for the first time, he asked himself, had he been saving money all this time, while unknowingly hurting the person closest to him? The question wasn't answered immediately, but it lingered. And Mike knew that if he didn't face it, that envelope wouldn't be the last of its kind to appear in their lives. That night, the sky was clear and star-filled, but the atmosphere inside the house felt heavier than usual. It wasn't because of an argument, but because everyone was lost in their own thoughts. Sarah lay with her back to Mike. She wasn't angry, nor did she want to make the situation worse. But there was an emptiness in her heart that hadn't been filled. She wasn't the type to complain, but when she did speak up, it meant she had been thinking about it for a very long time. Mike lay behind her, his eyes wide open in the darkness. He was unaccustomed to this feeling. Usually, when there was a problem, he would choose to stay silent and let it pass. But this time, the silence only made him more uncomfortable. He looked at his wife's back and whispered, Sarah? Sarah didn't turn over but answered, yes? Are you still angry? The simple question made Sarah pause. She didn't answer right away. After a few moments, she said softly, I'm not angry. Mike breathed a sigh of relief. But before his feeling of ease could settle, Sarah continued, but I am sad. The words I am sad, though spoken gently, felt heavier to Mike than any scolding. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, I didn't mean to make you sad. Sarah turned to face him. In the darkness, the dim light from the street was enough to reveal her husband's expression. I know, she said honestly. She understood Mike wasn't a bad person, he was just too used to his own way of life. So used to it that he didn't realize it could hurt someone else. But have you ever thought, Mike? Sometimes, what we consider normal can be a burden to someone else. Mike couldn't answer. Sarah didn't wait for a response. She turned back over and pulled the covers up. Let's just get some sleep. We still have to take Mom and Dad out tomorrow. The conversation ended, but it didn't end their thoughts. The next morning, Sarah woke up early as usual. She went to the kitchen, boiled water, and prepared breakfast. Mike also woke up earlier than usual. He came out and saw Sarah standing by the stove. The morning light filtering in made the small kitchen look warmer. He stood for a moment, then said, "I'll make the coffee." Sarah was a little surprised, but said nothing. Mike got the coffee and made 2 mugs. He handed one to Sarah. "Here you go." Sarah accepted it and nodded slightly. "Thanks." The two of them stood side by side, sipping their coffee in silence. But this silence was no longer as heavy as the night before. Soon after, John and Martha woke up. The family had a simple breakfast, and then Mike said, "Today, I'll drive you, Mom and Dad, around the city." Martha smiled. "You don't have to, son. We can just walk." "It's no trouble, Martha. I know the way." Sarah looked at Mike. There was a strange feeling in her heart, something hard to name. It wasn't a huge surprise, but it wasn't something she was used to seeing. The car moved slowly through the busy streets, carrying the 4 of them. John and Martha sat in the back. While driving, Mike said, "Where would you like to go? Just say the word." Martha laughed. "Anywhere is fine. The main reason we came was to see you too." Sarah turned around. "Mom, let's stop by the city park. It's really cool and shady there." "All right, honey. Wherever you take us, I'll go." Martha's cheerful voice made the atmosphere lighter. The city park was bustling in the morning. Seniors were exercising, young people were jogging, and small children were playing. Sarah and her mother sat on a park bench. While Mike went to buy drinks, Martha looked around and whispered, "It's so busy here, isn't it, honey?" "Yes, Mom. It's always like this in the city." After a moment, she turned to Sarah. "Sarah, about yesterday. What you did was the right thing." Sarah was a little taken aback. "I'm not saying I'm taking your side, but I can see you've been patient for too long," Martha continued. Sarah was silent. Martha went on. "But you also have to understand your husband. He was raised differently, so he thinks differently." Sarah nodded. "I know, Mom. I understand. Understanding is good, but understanding doesn't mean you have to accept everything. You need to speak up, but in a way that makes the other person willing to listen." Sarah smiled faintly. "Yes, Mom. I'm learning." Mother and daughter looked at each other and smiled. Mike returned with drinks for them. "Here you go, Martha." "Oh, thank you, son." He sat down and looked at Sarah. "Want to go anywhere else?" Sarah shook her head. "This is nice enough." Not long after, John joined them. He sat down and sighed. "The city bus is so crowded." The whole family laughed. The atmosphere was more cheerful, but Mike still felt that something in his heart was not yet resolved. That afternoon, the family returned home. Sarah went into the kitchen to cook. Mike didn't go straight to the living room as he usually would. He stood in the kitchen, watching his wife. "Let me help." Sarah turned. "You know how to cook?" Mike smiled. "If I don't, I can learn." Sarah handed him a knife. "Then please chop this onion." Mike took the knife. He awkwardly tried to chop it. The pieces were uneven, some big, some small. Sarah looked at them and laughed. "If you chop it like that, it'll cook unevenly. A little uneven is fine. It adds character." The two of them shared a small laugh. The atmosphere in the kitchen suddenly felt more intimate, like it had been in the early days of their marriage. But in Mike's heart, something was still pushing him. He put down the knife and looked at Sarah. "Sarah? Yes? I want to ask you something." Sarah stopped her work and turned. "Go ahead." Mike hesitated for a moment, then said, "All this time, have you ever felt like I looked down on you?" The question came suddenly, but Sarah didn't avoid it. "Sometimes," she answered plainly. Mike nodded, as if he had expected it. "You never said anything because you thought it was pointless, right?" Sarah didn't speak, but he added for her, "And you didn't want to make me feel bad." Hearing that, Mike's heart sank. He looked at his wife. For the first time, he saw clearly that Sarah wasn't always as strong as he thought. She just chose to endure it. He sighed. "I'm sorry." Sarah looked at him, not surprised, but she didn't respond immediately. "I'm sorry for never paying attention to your feelings." She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Just knowing that you realize it is enough." There was no scolding, no easy forgiveness, just a perfectly measured sentence. But it was that very sentence that made Mike feel he had to do more. He looked at the meal that was nearly ready and remembered yesterday's envelope. A small envelope that had forced him to rethink so many things. And he knew this story wasn't over. Because what needed to change wasn't the amount of money, the $20, but the way he saw the woman standing in front of him. Lunch that day proceeded in a very different atmosphere. Not because the food was more luxurious, but because everyone at the table showed small, noticeable changes. Sarah was still the first to serve her parents, still reminding everyone to eat before it got cold. Mike, sitting across from her, was no longer busy with his phone. He had placed it beside him and was focused on his lunch. These small details made the meal feel more whole. John looked at his son-in-law and asked gently, "Is your work very stressful, son?" Mike paused for a moment, thought, then answered, "Sometimes it can be quite stressful, John. Working in the city, everything has to be fast-paced." John nodded. "Yes, it's the same everywhere. But if there's pressure, you have to know how to release it. Don't let it weigh you down." Mike smiled faintly. "Yes, John. I'm learning." Sarah looked at him and smiled too. She noticed Mike was starting to talk more, no longer giving one-word answers as he used to. Martha took a piece of the stew and said, "This tastes just like it does back home, Sarah." Mike turned to his wife. "Did you learn from your mom?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, she taught me when I was little." Mike smiled. "I thought you learned everything from the internet all this time." The unexpected joke made the whole table laugh. Sarah laughed along, her heart feeling a little lighter. Laughter like this hadn't been heard at their dining table for a long time. After lunch, everyone rested. John stretched out on the sofa. Martha watched television. After Sarah finished cleaning the kitchen, she was about to sit with her mother, but Mike called her. "Sarah, can you come here for a minute?" She turned. "Yes, I want to talk." Sarah was a bit surprised but followed her husband to the small balcony. The balcony overlooked the alley below. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the warm afternoon sun. Mike stood there, his hands resting on the railing, not looking directly at Sarah. "I think we need to talk more clearly." Sarah said nothing, just stood beside him. "I know you've been holding back these past few days," Mike said. Sarah smiled faintly. "I'm not one to make a big deal out of things, but that doesn't mean I wasn't hurt." Mike's words made Sarah turn to look at him. He still wasn't looking at her, but his voice was softer. "I've been thinking a lot. Not just about yesterday, but about everything that's happened all this time." Sarah remained silent. "I always thought what I was doing was right," he continued. "Being frugal. Being careful, planning for the future. But I forgot one thing." He turned to look straight at his wife. "I forgot to ask how you felt." Sarah looked at him. Her gaze was no longer avoidant, but it wasn't overly emotional either. "Go on, Mike." Mike sighed. "I'm sorry for letting you feel all of that alone." Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked down at the alley below, then said, "You know, I don't need a lot of apologies." Mike was taken aback. "Then what do you need?" Sarah turned, her voice still gentle. "I need you to change the way you think, Mike." "The way I think?" "Yes," she said slowly. "You always thought that because I don't earn money, what I do has no value." Mike started to object, but then fell silent. Sarah continued, "But think about it. If I didn't do all of these things, who would?" The simple question left Mike unable to answer. You come home from work, dinner is ready, the house is clean. All of that doesn't just happen by itself. Sarah wasn't speaking quickly or pressuring him. She was simply explaining something very obvious. "I don't need you to think I'm amazing, I just need you to value what I do." Mike nodded slowly. "I understand." Sarah looked at him and asked, "Do you really understand?" Mike looked straight into her eyes. "This time, I think I really do." The two of them stood there without speaking further, but the distance between them felt a little smaller. That afternoon, a neighbor came to visit. "I heard your parents were in town, so I thought I'd stop by to say hello." Sarah looked pleased. "Brenda, please come in." Martha smiled. "Oh, thank you for stopping by." After a while, the conversation turned to daily life. Brenda turned to Mike and smiled. "You're a lucky man, Mike." Mike was surprised. "Lucky how?" "Having a wife like Sarah. She's hardworking, diligent, and so considerate." Sarah blushed. "Oh, Brenda, you're exaggerating." Brenda shook her head. "Not at all. All the neighbors here know it." Mike smiled. But inside, he was thinking. Brenda continued, I sometimes have to learn from Sarah how to manage a budget. Sarah quickly said, I just do what I can, Brenda. Mike looked at his wife, then remembered the times he had implied Sarah couldn't manage money. He had never considered that what his wife did was actually valued by others. That evening, after Brenda had gone home, Mike sat in the living room. Sarah was clearing away the last of the food, while her parents had gone to their room to rest. He called out, Sarah? Yes? I want to ask you for a favor. Sarah came out and looked at him. A favor for what, Mike? Mike hesitated slightly, then said, Can you teach me how to manage our finances? Sarah was stunned. What did you say, Mike? I'm serious. Mike smiled faintly. All this time, I thought I was the expert on this, but now I realize I might just be good at being cheap, not necessarily good at managing. Sarah looked at him. There was a little surprise in her heart, but also a sense of joy. You really want to learn? Yes. But you have to be willing to listen to me, right? Mike nodded. I'll listen. Sarah smiled. All right, we'll start tomorrow. They looked at each other and smiled. It wasn't a wide grin, but it was enough to ease everything that had happened. However, in Sarah's heart, there was still one thing she hadn't said, and she knew that one day, she would have to. As for Mike, for the first time, he felt that learning from his own wife was not something that diminished his pride, but a way to understand her better, and perhaps, to understand himself better too. The next morning, Sarah didn't go straight to the kitchen as usual. She set a small notebook and a pen on the dining table. Mike came out of the bedroom, saw her, and paused. Not cooking today, honey? Sarah looked at him and smiled faintly. I'm cooking. But before that, I'm going to teach you something. Mike looked at the notebook, then pulled out a chair and sat down. Starting right now? You said you wanted to learn. Yes, I'm ready. Sarah sat across from him and opened the notebook. On the first page, there were already a few lines of writing she had prepared. This is our family's expense ledger. Mike looked a little surprised. You've been keeping this since when? For a long time. Sarah flipped through the pages. Each page was a record for 1 week, detailing their income and every small expense. Take a look. Mike took the notebook and read it slowly. He was used to numbers, but the way Sarah had recorded everything surprised him. It wasn't just simple addition and subtraction. She had also made notes for unexpected expenses, for days when spending was higher, and even noted times when she managed to save. He looked at it for a long time, then said, I had no idea you were doing this. Sarah smiled faintly. You never asked. The sentence wasn't accusatory, but it still made Mike feel a little guilty. So, you manage all the money in the house? No, I only manage whatever you give me, Sarah said matter-of-factly. And sometimes, it's not enough. Mike looked up. Not enough? Why didn't you tell me? Sarah looked at him, her gaze calm. I tried to, but you always said we needed to be frugal. Mike fell silent. Sarah continued, I'm not against being frugal. But being frugal doesn't mean cutting out all necessities. She pointed to a line in the notebook. Like that time, the price of gas went up. I had to take money from the food budget. So we ate more simply that week. Mike looked at it and nodded slowly. Sarah went on, I didn't complain because I figured as long as I could manage it, it was fine. She closed the notebook and looked at her husband. But that day, for the first time, I felt like I couldn't manage it anymore. Mike understood she was talking about the lunch with her parents. He sighed. I'm sorry. Sarah shook her head. I don't need you to say that again. Then what do you need? Sarah thought for a moment, then said, I need you to do this with me. Mike was a little surprised. Together? Yes. Managing finances isn't just my job. It's our job, as husband and wife. Mike nodded. All right. From now on, I'll do it with you. Sarah smiled. Then let's start today. She opened the notebook and handed the pen to Mike. You write it down. Mike took the pen, a little awkwardly. Write what? Write down the food budget for today. How much? Sarah looked at him. What do you think is appropriate? Mike thought for a moment. Maybe $100 for the week? Sarah said nothing, just nodded. Okay, write that down. Mike wrote the number in the notebook. His handwriting wasn't as neat as Sarah's, but it was clear. He looked at it, then asked. So today we have that much to spend on groceries? Sarah smiled. No. It means today we have that much to eat more comfortably. The sentence made Mike laugh. What's the difference? There's a big difference, Sarah said gently. One is a restriction, the other is a choice. Mike looked at her and nodded. I get it. After finishing the entry, they went to the grocery store together. This time, Mike held the shopping cart. Sarah walked beside him, not saying much, just offering suggestions occasionally. This fish is fresh, Mike. Okay, let's get one. These vegetables are on sale today, we can get extra. Mike bought things without haggling over prices as much as before. Not because he didn't care, but because he was learning to trust in a balance. The cashier saw them and smiled. Well, look at you, Mike, helping with the shopping. Mike smiled back. Yeah, trying to learn. That's good. A husband who goes to the market makes a happy wife. Sarah, standing beside him, smiled faintly without saying a word. When they got home, Sarah cooked while Mike helped wash vegetables and peel onions. John stood in the kitchen doorway, looking in, and whispered to his wife, See? He's already changing. Martha nodded. Yes, but let's wait and see. The two of them smiled. Lunch that day had no envelope, no tension, just light conversation and laughter. But in the middle of the meal, John suddenly asked Mike, Son, in your opinion, is Sarah's work at home difficult? The direct question made Mike pause. He glanced at his wife, then answered, Yes, John. I think it is. John nodded. Yes, housework doesn't earn money, but that doesn't mean it has no value. Mike nodded. Yes, John. I understand. Sarah looked at him, saying nothing, but her expression softened slightly. That afternoon, while everyone was resting, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen. She opened her notebook again. Seeing Mike's handwriting from that morning, it wasn't beautiful, but it made her feel that something was genuinely changing. She didn't need Mike to be perfect. She just needed her husband to be willing to see, to understand, and to walk beside her. But in her heart, there was still one thing she hadn't said. She had considered going back to her hometown. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. She looked toward the door, where the evening light was streaming in. Maybe I should give him more time, she whispered to herself. Meanwhile, Mike was sitting on the porch with John. The two of them didn't talk much, but the atmosphere was no longer as awkward as before. After a moment, Mike said, John, can I ask you something honestly? Have you ever made Martha sad? John laughed. Of course, I have. Who hasn't? Then what did you do? John looked off into the distance, then said, You fix it. That's all. You know you did wrong, so you fix it. But you have to really fix it. The simple sentence made Mike think for a long time. He nodded. Yes, John, I get it. John looked at him and added, A husband and wife living together isn't about who's right or wrong, but about who is willing to understand first. Mike fell silent. He knew he was beginning to understand some things. But to truly change, it might still take time, and there might be many other things he would have to face. The afternoon passed calmly. But as evening approached, a small incident occurred that was enough to shake things up once again. After dinner, while Sarah was washing dishes, Mike's phone rang. He looked at the screen, frowned slightly, and then walked outside to answer it. Sarah didn't pay much attention, but as she passed the living room, she faintly heard her husband's voice. Yeah, Mom, I know. But I can't right now. Yes, I'll think about it. Mike's voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for Sarah to realize something was wrong. She didn't stop to eavesdrop. She continued with her work. A few moments later, Mike came back inside. His face looked a little tense. Sarah asked, What's wrong, Mike? Mike hesitated, then said, It was my mom. She said the money I sent this month was less than usual. Sarah nodded. Well, it was. Our expenses were higher this month. Mike sighed. But she doesn't understand. She thinks I'm holding back on her. Sarah fell silent. Mike continued, She even said, A son always changes after he gets a wife. The sentence made Sarah freeze. She wasn't angry, but the feeling was familiar. This wasn't the first time she had heard words like that. So what did you say? I told her it wasn't like that. Did she believe you? Mike smiled bitterly. I don't think so. Sarah said nothing more. She went back to washing the dishes. But in her heart, an old thought resurfaced. In the past, whenever there was a problem between Mike and his mother, she was usually the one who had to give in. No one forced her, but she understood it on her own. That night, after Sarah's parents had gone to bed, Mike sat with his wife. Sarah. Yes? I think we need to send some extra money to my mom. Sarah wasn't surprised. How much are you thinking of sending? Mike named a figure higher than usual. Sarah didn't refuse immediately. She just asked. Then what about our living expenses for the rest of the month? Mike was silent. Sarah opened her notebook and pointed to the detailed budget they had written. Look, Mike. We just adjusted this a few days ago. If we send that much extra, we'll have to cut from another category. Mike looked at it, but said nothing. Sarah asked again, which category do you want to cut? Mike sighed. I don't know. Sarah nodded. I don't know either. The two of them sat in silence. Sarah didn't want to make things difficult, but she also couldn't pretend there wasn't a problem. Mike, she said. Yeah? I'm not stopping you from being a good son to your mother. I know that's important. But we're a husband and wife. A decision like this, we have to think about it together. Mike nodded. I understand. Sarah looked at him and added, and you also need to explain things to your mom. It doesn't mean that every time there's a shortfall, it's my fault. The sentence was spoken gently but with great clarity. Mike looked at her, a little surprised. You think my mom thinks that? Sarah smiled faintly. She doesn't have to think it for it to be true. Mike fell silent. Sarah didn't continue. She closed her notebook. Let's just think about this later. Let's not ruin the mood while Mom and Dad are still here. Mike nodded. Okay. But in his heart, an internal conflict began to feel more pronounced. On one side was his responsibility to his mother. On the other was his current life with his wife. And for the first time, he realized that those two things couldn't always go hand in hand. The next morning, while Sarah was cooking, she heard Martha call out, Sarah, come here for a minute, honey. I want to talk to you. Okay, Mom. Just a second. Sarah turned off the stove, wiped her hands, and walked to the living room. Martha was sitting there, her expression not overly serious, but not relaxed either. I want to ask you something. Yes, Mom? About the finances in this house, do you and Mike discuss them often? Sarah was a little surprised but answered. Sometimes, Mom. Sometimes or rarely? Sarah thought for a moment. It used to be rarely, Mom. Lately, it's been more often. Martha nodded. That's good. Then she continued in a softer voice. I don't want to meddle in your marriage. But I see that if things aren't discussed clearly from the beginning, they can get complicated later on. Sarah sat beside her mother. I know, Mom. Don't hold everything in just because you're afraid of ruining the mood. Being patient once or twice is fine, but if it happens too often, it becomes a habit. Sarah smiled faintly. Yes, Mom. I'm starting to learn to speak up. Martha looked at her daughter, her gaze full of both love and worry. You don't have to say a lot. What's important is to speak at the right time and in the right way. Sarah nodded. Yes, Mom. Meanwhile, Mike was sitting on the porch with John. John asked, Did your mother call yesterday? Mike was a little surprised. How did you know? John smiled. I could see it on your face. Mike smiled back but couldn't hide his exhaustion. Yes, John. She's worried about money. John nodded. Parents from small towns are often like that. It's not because they're greedy, but because they're afraid of not having enough. Mike sighed. I understand, John. But sometimes I find it difficult. Difficult how? Because I don't know how to balance it all. John looked at him and said, You don't have to balance everything by yourself. Mike was surprised. What do you mean? You just need to be clear. Mike fell silent. John continued, Be clear with your wife, and be clear with your mother. Don't let one misunderstand the other. The sentence made Mike think. He nodded. Yes, John. I understand. That afternoon, while the whole family was eating, Mike's phone rang again. He looked at the screen, then stood up and walked outside to answer it. Sarah continued eating, but her ears were on high alert. A few moments later, Mike came back inside. His face couldn't hide the tension. Sarah asked, Your mom again? Yes. What is it? Mike sat down and whispered. She said she's coming to visit next week. The sentence made the whole table fall silent. Sarah didn't say anything right away. She just looked at her husband. She said she wants to see how we're living. Sarah smiled faintly. It wasn't a happy smile. Mike looked at her. What do you think? Sarah put down her fork and looked at her husband. I think we need to get ready. Ready for what? Sarah looked straight at him. Ready to be clear. Mike fell silent. Sarah continued. I don't want things to be like they've always been. The sentence wasn't spoken loudly, but it was very firm. Mike looked at his wife and nodded. All right. This time, I'll be the one to speak. Sarah didn't ask any more questions. She picked up her fork and continued eating. But in her heart, a new feeling was forming. Not worry, but readiness. As for Mike, for the first time, he felt he could no longer avoid it. Because this time, if he didn't speak clearly, what would appear wouldn't just be an envelope on the dining table, but a much greater distance between them. And he knew he didn't want that to happen again. The news of the mother-in-law's arrival changed the atmosphere in the house in a strange way. It wasn't an obvious tension, but rather a thin, invisible layer that seemed to coat every activity. Sarah continued to cook, clean the house, and chat with her parents as usual. Mike was no longer as dismissive as he used to be. He was even more proactive in asking questions. But they both knew an uneasy confrontation was on the horizon. That afternoon, while John and Martha were resting, Sarah sat at the dining table with her expense ledger open. She wasn't writing anything, just looking back at the previous pages as if reviewing something. Mike came out of the bedroom and saw her. "Checking the books again, honey?" Sarah nodded. "Anything wrong?" Sarah shook her head. "Not wrong. I just want to be clearer." Mike pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Clear about what?" Sarah looked at him, her gaze calm. "Clear so that when your mom comes, I'm not just passive." The sentence made Mike pause. "You think she's going to ask a lot of questions?" Sarah smiled faintly. "She doesn't have to ask. You can tell just from the way she talks." Mike fell silent. Sarah continued, "You know, I'm not afraid of a difficult mother-in-law." "Then what are you afraid of?" She looked straight at her husband. "I'm afraid you won't be on my side." The sentence left Mike unable to react immediately. He had never thought that the thing Sarah feared most was him. He started to say something, but Sarah gently cut him off. "I'm not saying this to blame you, Mike. I'm saying it so you understand." She closed her notebook. "This time, I'm not going to stay silent." Mike looked at his wife, his expression slowly becoming more serious. "I understand." Sarah nodded. "That's all I need." That evening, after Sarah's parents had gone to bed, the husband and wife sat together. Neither spoke at first, but they both knew it was time to talk. Mike was the one who broke the silence. "Sarah." "Yes? I think we need to get on the same page first." Sarah looked at him. "What do you want to say, Mike?" Mike took a breath. "About our money and the way we live." Sarah nodded. "Okay. I don't want there to be another misunderstanding when your mom arrives." Sarah looked at him and asked, "What are you planning to say to her?" Mike thought for a moment, then said, "I'm going to explain that we manage the money in this house together. It's not because you're wasteful. And I'm also going to tell her that you being at home doesn't mean you're just living off me." The words, this time coming from Mike himself, made Sarah look at him a little longer. Not out of surprise, but because she sensed his sincerity. "Do you think she'll listen?" Mike smiled faintly. "Probably not. But I still have to say it." Sarah nodded. "Yes. As long as you say it." They were silent for a moment. Then Sarah added, "And I." Mike looked at her. "You what?" "I'm not going to argue." Mike was surprised. "You're not?" Sarah smiled. "I don't like arguing in front of our parents." "So what will you do?" Sarah looked at him, her voice still gentle. "I'll speak when the time is right, and only as much as needed." Mike nodded. "I trust you." Sarah said nothing more, but in her heart, she was already prepared. 2 days later, John and Martha were getting ready to go back home. That morning, Sarah woke up early, cooking a few simple dishes so her parents could eat before they left. Martha looked at her daughter and said, "You have to take care of everything by yourself here. It must be tiring, honey." Sarah smiled. "I'm used to it, Mom." John, standing beside her, looked at Mike. "Remember what I told you the other day, son?" Mike nodded. "Yes, John. I remember. Not everything is about winning. What's important is taking care of each other." "Good." Sarah, standing there listening, felt her heart warm. She knew her father didn't say much, but every word he spoke was full of meaning. While seeing her parents off at the bus station, Sarah held her mother's hand. "Mom, travel safely." "Yes, you too." Martha looked at her daughter and whispered, "If anything happens, talk about it. Don't keep it inside." Sarah nodded. "I will, Mom." The bus started to move, leaving Sarah standing there watching it for a long time. Mike stood beside her without a word. After a moment, he asked, "Are you okay?" Sarah nodded. "I'm fine." She turned to her husband. "Now it's our turn to get ready." Mike understood what she meant. He nodded. "Yeah." That afternoon, Sarah cleaned the house. Not because company was coming, but to make it feel more comfortable. Mike helped her. He wiped the tables, swept the floors, doing chores he had rarely done before. Sarah watched him and asked, "Don't you feel strange?" "Strange, why? Doing work like this?" Mike smiled. It was strange at first, but I'm getting used to it. Sarah smiled faintly. If you really get used to it, I'll be very happy. Mike looked at her. I'm trying to get used to it. The simple sentence made Sarah's heart feel lighter. That evening, while they were watching TV, Mike's phone rang again. He looked at it and said, "It's Mom." Sarah said nothing. Mike answered the phone. "Hi, Mom." "Yes. Next week." "Okay, Mom, I already know. You don't need to bring anything." "Yes." He listened for a moment, then said, "Yes, Mom. Just come. We'll be home." After he hung up, Sarah asked, "What did she say?" "She's coming sooner than planned." Sarah nodded. "Good. So we don't have to wait long." Mike looked at her. "You're not worried?" Sarah smiled. "A little. But I'm surprisingly calm about this." "Why?" Sarah looked straight at her husband. "Because I know this time, I'm not alone." The sentence made Mike fall silent. He nodded slowly. "Yeah. You're not alone." That night, Sarah lay in bed thinking for a long time. She wasn't afraid of facing problems, but she understood that every word and action in the next few days could affect the course of their future. She didn't want to win against anyone. She just wanted to be understood correctly. As for Mike, for the first time, he felt he was in a different position. Not as the decision maker, but as a bridge between his mother and his wife, between old habits and a new way of life. And he knew that if he didn't handle this well, all the changes of the past few days would not be enough. Outside, the wind blew softly. Inside, two people lay side by side in silence. They both knew the coming days would not be easy. And it was for that very reason that it was time for them to truly stand together. The morning sun wasn't yet too strong, but the atmosphere inside the house already felt different. Not because anyone was speaking, but because everyone knew that today, Mike's mother was coming. Sarah woke up earlier than usual. She wasn't rushed, she did everything as she normally would. Boiling water, sweeping the house, preparing breakfast. But her every movement felt more deliberate, as if she were trying to maintain a steady rhythm. Mike also woke up early. He came out and saw his wife busy in the kitchen, then paused. "You're up early." Sarah turned and smiled faintly. "I'm used to it, Mike." Mike came closer, looking around. "Let me help." Sarah didn't refuse. She handed him a bunch of carrots. "Peel these, please." Mike sat down and began to peel the carrots. He was no longer as clumsy as he had been a few days ago, though he still wasn't very skilled. Sarah watched him for a moment, then whispered, "Mike." "Yeah? Today, remember what we talked about, okay?" Mike nodded. "I remember. You don't have to say a lot. Just speak at the right time." "I will." They didn't speak again, but their gazes conveyed a mutual understanding. Around 9:00 a.m., Mike's phone rang. "Mom's at the bus station. I'm going to pick her up." He stood and looked at Sarah. "I'm leaving." Sarah nodded. "Okay, Mike." She didn't go with him. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she wanted to give Mike some time alone with his mother first. About 20 minutes later, the sound of a car pulling up was heard outside. Sarah stepped out. She saw Mike carrying a bag. Behind him was a woman in her late 50s. She was small in stature but moved briskly, with sharp, observant eyes. This was Sharon, Sarah's mother-in-law. She walked in, looked around, and said, "The house is tidy enough." Sarah approached, with a warm smile. "Good morning, Sharon." Sharon nodded. "Hello." Her voice was not cold, but it wasn't warm either. Mike put down the bag. "Sit down, Mom. Rest." "Okay." The trip was pretty tiring. Sarah quickly poured a glass of water. "Please have a drink, Sharon." Sharon took the glass, took a sip, and then looked Sarah up and down, from head to toe. It wasn't a malicious look, but it was enough to make the person being watched feel they were being evaluated. "You're still just at home?" The question sounded casual, but it implied something else. Sarah didn't avoid it. "Yes, Sharon. I'm still at home." "No plans to go back to work?" Sarah smiled faintly. "I'm thinking about it, Sharon." Sharon nodded, not asking any more questions, but her gaze now shifted to Mike. "And how about you? Is work going well?" "It's okay, Mom. You need to work hard and make money. Can't fall short." Mike nodded. "I know, Mom." The atmosphere in the living room felt a little awkward. Sarah took the initiative. "You must be tired from your trip. Let me get some food ready for you." Sharon waved her hand. "Don't go to any trouble. Whatever you normally eat is fine." The sentence reminded Sarah of what Mike had said days ago. She didn't react, just nodded. Okay, Sharon. In the kitchen, Sarah began to cook. Mike stood in the doorway, looking in. Are you okay? Sarah turned and smiled faintly. I'm fine. Need me to help? No, just keep Mom company outside. Mike didn't leave right away. He looked at his wife for a moment, then said, if anything happens, just tell me. Sarah nodded. I know. In the living room, Sharon opened her bag and took out a few small gifts from her town. I brought these for you. Just some things from home, nothing special. Mike looked at them. You shouldn't have, Mom. It's no trouble. Just what I had at home. After a moment, she asked. Where's Sarah? In the kitchen, Mom. Oh. She was silent for a moment, then said, Mike. Yes, Mom? The money you sent this month was a little less, wasn't it? Mike knew this question was coming. Yes, Mom. Our expenses were a bit high this month. Sharon looked at him. Expenses for what? Mike took a breath. The cost of living went up, Mom. We're readjusting our finances. Sharon frowned. Readjusting how? Mike looked straight at his mother. We're managing our spending again, Mom. Sarah and I are discussing it together. The sentence made Sharon pause. You mean you never discussed it before? Mike said slowly, I wasn't very good about it before, Mom. Sharon looked at her son, her expression changing slightly. So who holds the money now? We hold it together, Mom. Together, how? Mike didn't hesitate. I give the money to Sarah to manage, but we discuss any big expenses. The explanation was clear and direct. Sharon was silent for a few seconds. Are you comfortable with that? Yes, Mom. I am. Mike's voice sounded more confident than before. In the kitchen, Sarah faintly heard the conversation. She wasn't eavesdropping, but she realized that Mike was saying what they had agreed upon. She continued cooking, her heart feeling a little calmer. Lunch was served. The dishes weren't extravagant, but they were complete. There was fried fish, a clear vegetable soup, and a simple stir-fry. Sarah placed the dishes on the table. Please eat, Sharon. Sharon looked at the food and said, not bad. A comment that was neither praise nor criticism. Everyone sat down. Mike didn't touch his phone. He served some food for his mother. Try this, Mom. Sharon tasted it and nodded slowly. It's good. Sarah said nothing, just continued eating. After a moment, Sharon put down her fork and looked at Sarah. So you can cook? Sarah nodded. But staying at home all the time is not a solution. The sentence made the atmosphere tense. Mike looked at his mother and said, Mom. Sharon turned. What? We've already discussed it. Sharon frowned. Discussed what? Mike said slowly, Sarah being at home doesn't mean she does nothing. She manages the house and our finances very well. Sharon looked at him, her eyes narrowing. Are you defending your wife? Mike didn't back down. I'm telling the truth, Mom. The answer left Sharon stunned. Sarah sat there without interfering, but the look in her eyes had changed. She was no longer someone who would just stay silent. Lunch continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer awkward, but not yet entirely comfortable. After the meal, Sarah cleared the plates, and Mike helped her. Sharon sat outside without a word. After a moment, she stood up and walked into the kitchen. Sarah turned. Yes, Sharon. Can I help you with something? Sharon looked at her and said, let me wash the dishes. Sarah shook her head. You don't have to, Sharon. I can do it. Sharon said nothing more, just stood there watching. After a moment, she said, do you have an expense ledger? Sarah was a little surprised. Yes, I do. Can I see it? Sarah glanced at Mike. Mike nodded slightly. Sarah got her notebook and handed it to her mother-in-law. Sharon took it, opened it, and read page after page. No one spoke. The atmosphere in the kitchen was so quiet that the sound of running water was clearly audible. And in that silence, something was slowly beginning to change. But in which direction, no one yet knew for sure. In the small kitchen, the sound of water still flowed, but the atmosphere was so quiet that each person could almost hear their own heartbeat. Sharon stood just behind Sarah, her hands holding the expense ledger. She didn't flip through it quickly, instead, she examined each page slowly and meticulously. Her gaze was no longer as sharp as it had been when she first arrived. It had transformed into a focused, unreadable stare. Sarah continued washing the dishes as usual. She didn't turn around, nor did she offer any explanation. It wasn't out of indifference, but because she knew some things were more convincing when seen firsthand than heard through stories. Mike stood beside her, drying the plates. His hands were working, but his eyes occasionally glanced at his mother. After what felt like a long time, Sharon closed the notebook. Sarah. Yes, Sharon? Sarah turned off the faucet, wiped her hands, and turned to face her mother-in-law. How long have you been keeping this? For quite a while, Sharon. How long? Sarah thought for a moment. Since I quit my job. Sharon nodded, then asked again, you record it every day? Almost every day, yes. Sharon looked at the notebook one more time, then said. There are no miscalculations. Sarah shook her head. I try to always be accurate. The room fell silent again. Mike didn't speak up. He knew this wasn't his moment to intervene. After a few moments, Sharon asked. So it balances out like this every month? Sarah answered with complete honesty. Some months it does, and some months it doesn't. And when it doesn't, what do you do? Sarah didn't flinch. I have to patch it from one category and cut from another. Sharon looked straight at her. Have you ever been short? Sarah smiled faintly. Yes, Sharon. The answer made Sharon pause. When you're short, what do you do? Sarah said very softly. Sometimes I reduce our portion sizes, sometimes I postpone non-urgent expenses. Hearing that, Mike's hand, which was drying a plate, stopped moving. He had never known about that. Sharon also didn't speak right away. She looked at the notebook, then at Sarah. Why didn't you say anything? Sarah answered with a calm voice. Because I thought as long as I could handle it myself, it didn't need to be said. The sentence contained no accusation, but it made the atmosphere in the kitchen feel heavier. Mike stood there. For the first time, he felt he had missed so much. Sharon placed the notebook on the counter and walked out. Sarah went back to washing the dishes. Mike stood beside her, not knowing what to say. After a moment, he spoke. Sarah, why didn't you tell me about that sooner? Sarah didn't turn around. I tried to, Mike. Mike was stunned. But you thought I was complaining. The answer left Mike unable to argue. Sarah continued, I don't blame you. Because back then, I also didn't know how to explain it in a way you would understand. Mike sighed. The feeling in his heart grew heavier. He said nothing more. In the living room, Sharon sat in silence, her hand resting on the notebook. She wasn't opening it anymore, just staring at a distant point. After a moment, she called out, Mike. Yes, Mom. Mike came out and sat across from her. Answer my question honestly. Okay, Mom. The money in this house, do you give it all to your wife? Mike didn't hesitate. Most of it, Mom. How much? Mike stated the figure clearly. Sharon nodded. And how much do you keep for yourself? I keep a little for personal expenses, Mom. So your wife decides everything else? Mike said slowly. We decide together, Mom. Sharon looked at him. You trust her that much? It was a direct question, without any pleasantries. Mike looked at his mother and answered, Yes, Mom. I do. Why? Mike didn't answer right away. He thought for a moment, then said. Because I've seen what Sarah does. Sharon was silent. Mike continued. I never used to pay attention, Mom. But these last few days, I've seen it clearly. Seen what? That she's not a wasteful person. She's someone who is working very hard to keep our family stable. Mike's voice was not loud, but was firm. Sharon looked at her son. Her gaze was no longer as sharp as before. In the kitchen, Sarah faintly heard him. She wasn't eavesdropping, but she could feel every word Mike spoke. She didn't come out, just continued her work, but in her heart, she felt a strange mix of relief. A few moments later, Sharon called for Sarah. Yes, Sharon? Sarah came out and stood before her. Sit down. Sarah sat. The three of them sat in a small circle. No one spoke at first. Finally, Sharon broke the silence. You've kept this notebook for a long time. Yes, Sharon. Then why was there an envelope on the dining table the other day? The question made Mike turn to look as well. Sarah didn't avoid it. That day, I wanted Mike to see it more clearly. See what? Sarah looked straight ahead. To see what can be done with $20. The room fell silent. Sharon didn't say anything right away. She looked at Sarah for a long time. You did that? Weren't you afraid your parents would misunderstand? Sarah shook her head. I wasn't thinking that far ahead, Sharon. Then what were you thinking? Sarah answered with complete honesty. I thought that if we didn't talk about it, there would be even more problems later. The answer left Sharon with no more questions. After a moment, she said, You're not a weak woman. Sarah was a little surprised. I mean, you don't like to argue, but you also don't just give up. Sarah didn't know what to say. Sharon continued, I used to think you stayed at home because you were lazy. Sarah remained silent. But now I see, even at home, you're not taking it easy. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, Sharon. The atmosphere thawed slightly. Mike looked at his mother and his wife. He said nothing, but in his heart, something was slowly becoming clearer. He no longer needed to stand in the middle. He just needed to stand in the right place. Sharon stood up and picked up the notebook. Keep this safe. Sarah nodded. I will. But from now on, if there's a problem, talk about it. Sarah looked at her. I will, Sharon. Don't make people have to guess. Sarah understood that sentence wasn't just for her. She nodded once more. That afternoon, the atmosphere in the house was different. No longer as tense as the morning, no longer as awkward as the day before, but not yet completely relaxed. Because what had just been discussed was only the beginning. There were still many things ahead that needed to be understood more deeply. And this time, no one wanted to remain silent. The afternoon passed in a silence different from previous days. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a pause that allowed everyone to think more clearly. Sharon was no longer as talkative as when she had first arrived. She sat in the living room, occasionally looking around the house, sometimes glancing into the kitchen where Sarah was preparing dinner. Sarah worked as usual, but this time she no longer felt she had to be overly cautious. She wasn't trying to cook something exceptionally special to make an impression, nor was she withdrawn. She was just doing what she normally did, naturally. Mike sat beside his mother, but his gaze often drifted to the kitchen. Not out of worry, but because he was learning to observe, to understand the things he had once ignored. After a while, Sharon stood up and walked straight into the kitchen. Sarah turned. Yes, Sharon? Can I help you with anything? Sharon didn't answer right away. She stood there, watching how Sarah tasted the food, how she organized everything. Have you been cooking this dish for a long time? Sarah looked into the pot of soup and answered, for a while, yes. Did you cook often when you were still working? Not really. Maybe on weekends. Sharon nodded. So now you take care of everything. Sarah smiled faintly. I'm used to it. Sharon said nothing more. She came closer, took a spoon, and tasted a little of the broth. Sarah was a little surprised, but remained silent. After tasting it, Sharon nodded very slowly. It's good. Just one word, but it was enough to make Sarah's heart feel a little warmer. Dinner that night took place in a very different atmosphere. It wasn't loud or overly cheerful, but there was an indescribable sense of relief. Mike, on his own initiative, served some food for his mother, then turned and served some for his wife. Sarah looked at him without a word, just a slight nod. Sharon watched the interaction between them, her gaze no longer as scrutinizing as before. After a while, she asked, Sarah. Yes, Sharon? If you go back to work someday, who will take care of the house? Sarah answered plainly. We'll share the duties, Sharon. How will you share them? Sarah glanced at Mike. Mike will help. Mike nodded. Yes, Mom. I'll help. Sharon raised an eyebrow slightly. You can do that? Mike smiled faintly. I'm learning, Mom. The answer made Sharon laugh a little, for the first time since she arrived. Well, that's good then. After dinner, Sarah cleared the table, and Mike helped her without being asked, without any need to delegate tasks. The two of them seemed to understand their roles. Sharon sat outside, watching them. After a moment, she called for Mike. Yes, Mom? Mike wiped his hands and came out to sit beside her. Sharon was silent for a moment, then said, I used to think you could handle everything. Mike said nothing. But now I see, there are things that you don't see. Mike nodded. I know, Mom. Sharon looked at her son. Knowing is good. But after you know, you have to act on it. Yes, Mom. Don't make your wife have to tell you things over and over. Mike looked toward the kitchen where Sarah was standing. I understand, Mom. In the kitchen, Sarah faintly heard them, but she didn't eavesdrop. She didn't need to hear everything, just enough to know that things were moving in the right direction. A few moments later, Sharon stood up and went into the kitchen. Sarah. Yes, Sharon? Let me finish this part. Sarah was a little surprised. You don't have to, Sharon. I can do it. I know you can. But let me try. Sarah looked at her, then nodded. Okay, Sharon. The two of them stood side by side, doing the simple work. After a moment, Sharon said, You're not the type to argue. Sarah smiled faintly. I'm not used to it. But you're also not the type to just give up. Sarah was silent. Sharon continued, That's a good thing. A person who knows when to speak up will have a stronger relationship. The sentence made Sarah feel that her mother-in-law no longer saw her as she had before. It wasn't total acceptance, but a deeper understanding. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, Sarah and Mike sat together. Neither spoke at first. After a moment, Mike broke the silence. Sarah. Yes? Today felt different. Sarah looked at him. Different how? My mom isn't like she was at the beginning. Sarah nodded. Yes. What did you do? Sarah smiled. I didn't do anything special. Then why did she change? Sarah thought for a moment, then said, maybe because this time, I didn't stay silent. Mike looked at her. You didn't argue, but you also didn't avoid it. Yes. Mike nodded. I'm learning. Sarah smiled. You're a fast learner. Because I don't want to lose you. The sentence made Sarah pause. She said nothing, but her expression softened. That night, the two of them slept more soundly than they had in days. Not because all their problems were solved, but because they knew they were heading in the right direction. The next morning, Sharon woke up early. She went to the kitchen and saw Sarah already there. You're up early, dear. I'm used to it, Sharon. Sharon looked around and said, I want to go to the farmer's market with you today. Sarah was a little surprised, but nodded. Of course, Sharon. The two of them walked to the market together. The morning air was cool. The market was busy, but not noisy. Sharon walked beside her, not saying much, just asking occasionally. How much is this? Is that one fresh? Sarah answered gently. After a while, Sharon said. Have you always gone to the market alone? Yes. Don't you ever get tired? Sarah smiled. I get tired, but I'm used to it. Sharon nodded without another word. On the way home, she suddenly said, Sarah. Yes. Sharon? About what happened the other day, with the envelope. Sarah looked at her. At first, I didn't like what you did. Sarah wasn't surprised. I know. But now I think it was necessary. Sarah said nothing. Sharon continued, there are some things you have to see with your own eyes to understand. The sentence, this time, no longer carried a tone of rebuke, but one of acknowledgement. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, Sharon. They arrived home. Mike saw them and asked. How was the market, Mom? Sharon smiled faintly. It was fine. Then she looked at Sarah. Go ahead and cook. Sarah nodded. Okay, Sharon. In the small kitchen, three people stood together. No one said much, but the atmosphere was no longer distant. And for the first time, Sarah felt she no longer had to prove anything. Just by being herself, others would eventually understand. The morning started more lightly than the previous days, but Sarah could feel that something was about to reach its peak. Not the end of a problem, but a definitive turning point. After returning from the market, Sarah and Sharon stood together in the kitchen. Mike was there too, no longer just observing from the doorway, but actively participating. 3 people, 3 positions, but this time there was no distance. Sarah was slicing vegetables, Mike was cleaning fish, and Sharon sat peeling onions. It was a very ordinary scene. But it was this very ordinariness that had been so difficult to achieve before. After a moment, Sharon spoke up. Mike. Yes, Mom? The way you're washing that fish, it's still going to be fishy. Mike looked up, a little awkwardly. I'm not used to it yet, Mom. Sarah smiled faintly. Here, let me show you. She came over, took her husband's hands, and showed him the proper way to clean the fish. Sharon watched the scene without a word, but her expression softened slightly. After a moment, she said. So you're willing to learn now? Mike smiled. If I don't, my wife will nag me. Sarah turned. I never nag. I just remind you. Same difference, Mike retorted playfully. The 3 of them laughed. A small laugh, but enough to warm the entire kitchen. Lunch that day featured a new dish, fish in a creamy sauce, made by Mike with Sarah's guidance. It wasn't perfect. It was a little too salty, and the sauce hadn't thickened properly, but everyone tried it. Sharon took a piece and said, not bad. Mike asked, really, Mom? Yes, for a first try, it's pretty good. Sarah looked at him, smiling. See, you're making progress. Mike smiled, a little embarrassed. Still have a lot to learn. The atmosphere at the dining table was light and cheerful. But after the meal, while everyone was having coffee, Sharon suddenly spoke up. I want to say something. Sarah and Mike looked at her simultaneously. Her voice wasn't heavy, but it was clear. About your money and the way you live. The atmosphere tensed slightly. Sarah didn't shy away. She sat up straight, her gaze calm. Mike also didn't look away. He looked at his mother, waiting. Sharon put down her coffee cup. I used to think Sarah stayed at home because she didn't want to work. And I also thought the family finances should be handled by the man of the house. Mike frowned slightly, but didn't interrupt. But after being here for a few days, I see things are different. She looked at Sarah. You are not lazy. Sarah said softly, no, Sharon. And you are not wasteful. Sarah nodded. No, I'm not. Sharon turned to Mike. And you? Yes, Mom? It's not that you don't care about your family, but the way you showed you cared wasn't enough. Mike didn't argue. I know, Mom. Sharon continued, you thought being frugal was good. But being so frugal that it makes others feel unappreciated is not good at all. The sentence made Mike look down. Sarah sat there without a word, but every word resonated with what she had once felt. After a moment, Sharon continued, I'm not saying this to blame anyone. I'm saying it so you both understand. Living together isn't just about having enough to eat and enough to wear. She looked at Sarah. It's also about feeling valued. The sentence made Sarah slowly clench her hands. Not out of tension, but because finally, someone had articulated what had been so hard for her to express. Mike looked up. Mom, I'm sorry. Sharon looked at him. Are you apologizing to me or to your wife? Mike didn't hesitate. To both of you. Sarah looked at him, the distance in their gazes gone. Sharon nodded. Knowing how to admit you're wrong is a good thing. Then she turned to Sarah. And you, what you did was right. Sarah was a little surprised. You didn't argue, but you didn't just give in either. That was the right way. Sarah lowered her head slightly. Thank you, Sharon. After that, the atmosphere felt incredibly light. There was no more doubt, no more distance. The three of them sat there as if they had just passed through something very important. That afternoon, Sharon started packing. Sarah saw her and asked, Are you leaving already? Yes, dear. It's time for me to go. Why not stay a few more days? Sharon smiled faintly. This was long enough. Sarah didn't press her, just said, Okay, Sharon, let me pack some food for you to take. Don't go to any trouble. It's no trouble, just a moment. Sarah went to the kitchen, prepared a few items, and wrapped them neatly. Mike stood beside her, helping. How are you feeling? Sarah looked at him. About your mom or about us? Mike smiled. Both. Sarah thought for a moment, then said, I feel okay. Really? Yes. Sarah looked at him. This time, I felt like you were on my side. Mike nodded. I'll always be like this from now on. Sarah said nothing more, but her expression had changed. Before getting into the taxi, Sharon stood at the doorway, looking at her son and daughter-in-law. Sarah. Yes, Sharon? If anything happens, talk about it. I will. Don't let there be a need for another envelope. The sentence made all three of them laugh. Sarah nodded. Yes, Sharon. Sharon turned to Mike. And you? Yes, Mom? Learn to listen to your wife more. Mike smiled. I'm working on it, Mom. Good. Keep at it until it's a habit. The taxi departed. Sarah and Mike stood watching it until it disappeared from sight. Neither of them spoke. After a moment, Mike turned to Sarah. Thank you. Sarah looked at him. Thank you for what? For not giving up on me. Sarah smiled faintly. I almost did, you know. Mike was stunned. Really? Yes. Sarah looked straight ahead. But I thought if I gave up too soon, we would never have the chance to understand each other. Mike nodded. I'm glad you didn't. Sarah smiled. I'm glad you were willing to change. They looked at each other. No more words were needed, because they knew the most important thing wasn't about who was right, but that they had both chosen to stay and understand each other more deeply. And this time, it wasn't out of obligation, but a genuine desire to walk together. After Sharon's departure, the small house of Sarah and Mike returned to its normal rhythm. But if one were to look closely, they would feel that things were no longer the same. There were no drastic changes, no grand gestures, just small details that made a difference every day for those living it. The next morning, Mike woke up early. Not because of any urgent business, but because he just woke up naturally. He walked to the kitchen and saw Sarah already preparing breakfast, as usual. He no longer just stood and watched. Let me help. Sarah turned, no longer surprised. Make the coffee, please, Mike. You got it. Mike did it without needing further instructions. The way he held the mug, the way he brewed the coffee, it wasn't perfect, but it was no longer as clumsy as before. The two of them stood side by side, not talking much, but the silence no longer felt like a distance. After breakfast, Mike took the initiative. I'm heading to work a bit early today. Sarah nodded. Okay, Mike. What do you want for dinner? Sarah smiled. I can figure something out. I know, but I wanted to ask. Sarah looked at him and said, maybe I'll just make something simple. Mike nodded. I'll be home early this afternoon. We can cook together. All right. A sentence like that, if spoken in the past, might have just been empty words. But this time, Sarah believed her husband would follow through. The following days settled into a new rhythm. Money was no longer a sensitive topic that was difficult to discuss. There was no longer one person making decisions while the other stayed silent. The expense ledger was still on the table, but now it didn't just contain Sarah's handwriting. Mike also made entries. His numbers were still sometimes off, his lines weren't straight, but every time he wrote, he learned something new. One day, after making an entry, he turned to Sarah. Do you think we need to adjust this category, honey? Sarah looked at it and explained, that's a fixed expense, Mike, we can't reduce it. If we want to save, we can cut back from other categories. A conversation like this had never happened before. Not because they didn't have problems, but because they had never truly sat down together to understand each other. One afternoon, while Sarah was cleaning the house, Mike came home early, just as he had promised. He walked in, put down his bag, and asked, Are you tired today? Sarah was a little surprised. Why do you ask? It looks like you had a lot to do. Sarah smiled faintly. It's like this every day, Mike. Mike looked around and said, but now I see it differently. Differently how? Because before, I never paid attention. Sarah was silent for a moment, then smiled. You're paying attention now. That's enough. Mike nodded. He walked into the kitchen and rolled up his sleeves. I'm making the beef stew tonight. Sarah laughed. Are you sure, Mike? Not entirely. But I have you. Sarah looked at him, her expression softening. All right, I'll be your assistant. Dinner that night was nothing special, just beef stew, boiled vegetables, and a simple soup. But as they sat down, Mike suddenly said, Sarah. Yes? I want to say it one more time. Sarah looked at him. I'm sorry for making you feel unappreciated before. Sarah didn't answer right away. Mike continued. I thought being frugal was the right thing to do, but I forgot that some things can't be measured in money. Sarah looked at him, the distance between their gazes completely gone. I don't need you to be perfect, Mike. I know. I just need you to understand me. Mike nodded. I'm learning. Sarah smiled faintly. That's enough. A week later, Mike's phone rang. It was Sharon. He answered it. Hi, Mom. Yes. We're doing fine. Yes. Sarah wasn't standing near him, but she could faintly hear. After a moment, Mike handed the phone to Sarah. Mom wants to talk to you. Sarah was a little surprised but took it. Hello, Sharon? She heard Sharon's voice on the other end, no longer as sharp as it used to be. Sarah, I've been thinking a lot these past few days. Sarah listened silently. About what happened, I was also in the wrong. Sarah said softly. It's okay, Sharon. No, it's not. I didn't fully understand you. Sarah said nothing. I'm at peace now. The sentence made Sarah pause. I'm at peace because I know you know how to handle yourself, and Mike knows how to be a better husband. Sarah glanced at Mike and said, Yes, Sharon. If anything happens, discuss it together. Don't let a small problem become a big one. Sarah nodded, even though her mother-in-law couldn't see. I know, Sharon. The call ended. Sarah handed the phone back to Mike. No one spoke. But they both understood that a long-standing tension had been released. That afternoon, Sarah opened her notebook again. She turned back to the page where $20 was written. A small page that had opened up so much. She didn't tear it out. She folded the corner and left it there. Mike saw her and asked, Still keeping that, honey? Sarah nodded. Yes. What for? Sarah smiled. As a reminder. A reminder of what? Sarah looked at him. A reminder that small things, if not talked about, can become big. Mike nodded. Yeah. That envelope made me understand a lot of things too. Sarah smiled faintly. I didn't expect it to be so effective either. They both laughed. That night, the husband and wife sat on the porch. The wind blew softly, bringing a peace that felt real. Mike said, Sarah. Yes? If you could go back to that moment, would you do anything differently? Sarah thought for a moment, then shook her head. No. Why? Because if that hadn't happened, we might have stayed the same as before. Mike nodded. That's true. Sarah looked at him. But I also learned something. What's that? That being silent doesn't always keep the peace. Mike smiled. And I learned that managing money isn't always enough. They looked at each other. No more words were needed, because they already understood. Life after that went on. There were still busy days, still tired moments, but there was no longer the feeling of one person shouldering the burden while the other didn't care. They had learned not just to live together, but to truly be a team.